Welcome to Consulting Mastery, where we help B2B consultants master the business of consulting. I'm Carrie.
And I'm Ahmed. Join us as we explore the art of delivering outstanding client value, earning a higher income, and thriving in today's marketplace. How much time do people waste trying to control things they can't control?
Would it be wrong for me to say most of the time? Far too much time?
It's wild, right?
Disproportionately, far too much time.
And it defies all logic.
It does.
You can't control when that client signs. You can't control whether or not they're going to say yes. You can't control the circumstances that they're facing. You can't control that they got distracted by this other big shiny object that's delaying them from signing your contract. None of this is coming from a real scenario, obviously, right? So we had a chat with some clients earlier today, and it's good news. You know, this client's got a big deal. She's reeling it in, and I don't think she's guilty of this, to be fair, but I think we see a lot of people who are guilty of this. You got to, and this is a very specific example, but it applies more broadly to a lot of other scenarios, right? But here's a common one that you as a listener probably have engaged with. You've got one on the line. They're on the hook. Contracts out, agreements out. They verbally agreed. Silence. Crickets. Delays. I was talking to somebody yesterday who, they were complaining every month. The client says next month, next month, next month, next month. There's always something. There's always some other priority, some other shiny object, some other distraction. And the warning here really is there's only so much you can control when it comes to the deal. And obviously we're going to have a broader conversation here today, but let's talk about deals. Let's talk about clients, let's talk about contracts. You can control certainly the marketing that leads up to a discovery call. You can control the discovery call. You can control the offer. You can control the objection handling. You can control everything that you do in the sales process. But at the end of the day, they're going to make the decision and they're going to make it on their timing. And that you can't control.
Yeah, and what came up as you were saying that is interesting because there is a question about how much you control, and it's much less than most people. I'm not saying what most people think, but the way that most people respond to or feel that they can control. The other thing that's really interesting about this may be a bit of an off-ramp, is you also know much more than you think you know. Because the other dangerous path that people go down when they're in this scenario is they don't understand, they don't have visibility as to why the delays are happening, but they really, our human brains, right, really want to explain it away. So the story gets built. Well, it must be because they don't want my service. They don't think I did a good job. They didn't like what I said. I did a horrible job in the pitch. And I'm just saying this because we found this out in that same conversation about a different client where the real reason was the client had a baby, right? Or somebody got sick, or another big issue came up in their business, and that's what they've been focused on. So there's also something here around just either recognizing you really don't know, or at least assuming positive intent, because our brains don't generally take us down a constructive path when we're trying to figure out why the gap exists, right? Why the timeline is slowed down. We tend to fill that gap with all sorts of, catastrophizing, all sorts of, oh, it must be all about me, which is another danger. But I just think that's a really interesting piece to call out as we talk about this.
Yeah, I mean, unless you hear a no, it's never a no, right? A non-response is not a no. A non-response is just that. It's a non-response. And there's an infinite number of reasons why they might not respond to you. And I think to take a step back here and look at why deals get delayed, there's lots of reasons that have nothing to do with you or your price point or your offer or how good looking you are, right? Or like any of that, right? And you really have to understand that working with a consultant is change. It triggers change. It means we're going to change something. We're going to fix something. And often I wouldn't say often, I would say, the vast majority of the time, the obstacle to working with you is not you. It's the change that the client has to navigate in order to work with you. Change the structures, change the processes, change the time allocations, change the priorities, change to other correlated systems, etc. Right? There's all this change. And the bigger the organization, typically, the more significant and impactful the change is going to be. And so a lot of times you have, overzealous buyers who want to do it. They absolutely want to do it. And you get that impression in your interactions with them. And then they delay and you're like, what's going on? What's going on is they need to navigate all the other things they're going to break as a result of this. And sometimes that takes time. And that's, in terms of what you can do, what you can control is you can show up and help them navigate that change. You can be that consultant, right? Or you can be the consultant that sends an email every week and says, hey, just checking in. One's certainly going to help you push the deal forward. The other one's just going to annoy people.
Well, let's talk about that, because that seems to be the instinct, right? The just checking in, wonder what you're thinking. Are you still thinking about me? How do you feel about me? We're not proposing here that you shouldn't follow up, but the usual kind of easy to dash off email, which is exactly that, right? Oh, just checking in. It's been a while since we talked. How are things going? To your point, that is not inspiring, right? That is not helping them move farther along that path. All that's doing is having you be this little fly in their ear at a time where they are, to your point, navigating a whole bunch of stuff. And this is also very true. Your only interaction with them has been about one particular thing, right? One piece of their work, one need that they have, one problem that they're trying to solve. Most people that you're dealing with, even if yours is the most important problem, are also still, running their business or their portion of the business, whatever the case may be. So the last thing you want to be is just another irritant, right? Something else that they need to get back to, something else that's on their to-do list. So the question really is, how can you circle back to the client in a way that is supportive of them and their process and helps them to figure out how they're going to navigate through this change?
And I think it begins with the initial conversations, right? So one of the things you ought to be asking is, what does your decision-making process look like from here on out? And what are the considerations that you're going to have to go through in order to decide on if we work together and the timing? And you want to have an open conversation about that. Well, I think the operations team is going to have a say on this, right? Or I think, Bob from, logistics is going to have some concerns here. We need, whatever it is, right? You want to have an open and honest conversation about what it's going to take to get the deal done. And then you have a roadmap. Right now, all of a sudden, there's no surprises, right? When things get delayed, you know why they got delayed, because you had a conversation about it up front, and you can position yourself as a resource to help the client navigate some of those changes to the extent that that's possible.
Absolutely. And at the sort of simplistic end of this transaction, that also gives you a way to go back into the conversation. Because if you know that the next step was to talk to whoever you just said, Bob in accounting, logistics, wherever they are, wherever Bob works, and there's a delay, then you can ask them specific questions. I know you're going to have this conversation with Bob. Where do we stand on that? And that is a much more welcome outreach than, hey, what are you thinking?
Yeah. And I think the point of this conversation was focused on what you can control. So in the deal, there are things you can control. There are things that you can do, help the client with, to overcome and navigate the change that they're facing. And that kind of posture begins in the very beginning, in the earlier conversations. There's a point at which you are over investing. And again, we're using this as an example of one of the things that you might be focusing on that you can't control. You can affect and influence timing and their decision. You can't control timing in their decision. There's a subtle but important distinction there. You can influence, you can persuade. You can't control. And there's a point in time where you need to not so much cut your losses, but hedge your bets and say, well, you know what? The time I'm investing in this deal, is going the incremental time I'm investing here is going to be better spent bringing more deals to the table, filling up my pipeline, having more irons in the fire. I always tell people, if you're frustrated that the clients aren't buying when they say they're going to buy, right, in the timeline they say that they will, which is all the time, the best thing to do is fill up your pipeline with more deals so that, law of averages, some of them will close on time. And the ones that delay will get delayed, but you're not bothered because you have other deals that you're working on. That you can control. You can control filling your pipeline. You can't control when Bob from logistics gets his act together.
Absolutely. And having that full pipeline doesn't only allow you to, approach this particular deal in a certain way, but it also just changes, and we've talked about this before, your approach to everything, right? Working out of a sense of desperation, out of a sense of I need this, is a dangerous place to be for a whole bunch of reasons, right? You're not likely to present yourself well. You're not likely to you're less likely, quite frankly, to close the deal because of the kind of language and positioning and behavior that you're going to bring to the table. And you're going to have a really hard time positioning yourself as the expert that you are if you are, feeling so needy that you are just kind of letting them drag you along through the process and, bounce you around from place to place.
There's a subtle point there that I think we're actually going to dive deeper into in the next episode, just around having some kind of productive plan of action. There's a feeling when you're engaged in productive activity. There's I think a very tangible feeling of progress that's being made when you're pursuing something productively, focusing on things you can control. And it's the opposite of, if I'm waiting for a deal to close and I sit around in my office and I stare at the wall thinking about the deal, right? That's only going to lead to feelings of despair, a lack of control, a lack of agency, a lack of, any kind of real impact or influence over your outcomes, right? And that's going to be a damaging mindset for you. It's going to show up in all kinds of ways versus productive action in areas that you can control, where you have agency, you can make an impact. That's going to produce a very different feeling, which is going to make you show up differently and ultimately get better outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. It's recognizing that you want control, right? As humans, we want control. And the goal is to increase the amount of control you have, but that goal is across the board. You can't increase the amount of control you have around a particular deal in this example. But what you can do is increase the amount of time in your day where you feel like you are working in that space of control.
And apply this, we're just using the deal as an example, right? Apply this to everything. Anytime you're starting to feel a little bit like, why are things going this way? You're frustrated. It's not going the way you wanted it to. Ask yourself, what can I control in this situation? I think that applies to deal making. That applies to client scenarios. Newsflash, you can't control client results. You can't. You're not the only factor. You are one factor that determines results. The client and their organization and their execution and the market and all these things are other factors. You can't control everything there. You can only control your inputs into the process. So control those and release yourself of the responsibility of everything else. Same goes for your team. You can't control your team's output. You can influence, you can persuade, you can help, you can coach, you can support, you can mentor. You can't control. There's a point at which you have to let go and let them perform or not, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. So, long story short, what's the takeaway today?
Know what you can control, know what you can't control. Mitigate and limit the time that you spend thinking about or worrying about the things that you can't control, and maximize on what you can control.